Политбюро ЦК ВКПБ приняло решение всех этих военнопленных из этих 3 специальных лагерей расстрелять.
The Katyn massacre was the first mass execution of this scale in World War II. Nazis will follow suit only later. Mass murder in Katyn unleashed the industrial killing, which will soon turn World War II into the most bloody carnage in human history. After Katyn, the Soviets carried out massacres on a regular basis. Riga, Tartu, Lviv, Minsk. Relatives could not identify many of the corpses. Horrific torture had made them unrecognizable. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had become an allied power. The Soviet officers who pulled out fingernails, cut tongues, and perforated the skulls of their victims with nails were paid with Western aid. The British War Crimes Act gives them immunity from persecution in Britain, because war crimes, by definition, were committed only by the Germans.
You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs.
The entire Western world has lived for 60 years on the assumption that all crimes were Nazi crimes, and it's very difficult to change it. Whether Europe will ever come to terms with this criminal part of its past is difficult to know. But mass killing is mass killing. There should be no distinction between one side and the other.
And yet there is. The Soviet officers who shot more than 20,000 unarmed people were decorated.
Майор Супруненко, который расстреливал в Катыни, получил тогда низший орден, который был, это знак почета, трудовой орден, ну там же работа же. А Серов, который потом был председателем КГБ, он за расстрел польских офицеров получил орден Ленина. Это была высшая государственная награда.
World War II left more than 27 million Soviet citizens dead. The Communist Party always tried to decrease that number. Why? Because only a fraction of them were killed by the Germans.
You have to remember that when the Red Army marched, behind the Red Army was a second army, the NKVD army, which had its own tanks, its own machine guns and so on, firing forward so that nobody could move back.
Когда пришли наши, то специальные части снимали жетоны с наших солдат.
Viktor Baturin, chairman of the Russian Military History Association, tells the shocking story of how, after major battles, special Soviet units raided battlefields and tore the dog tags off the dead Soviet soldiers to make them unidentifiable. No other country in the world has treated its war dead in this way. Due to the appalling policies of the Soviet authorities, more than 1 million Soviet citizens joined the Nazi side.
Клянусь быть верным и беспрекословно повиноваться вождю и главнокомандующему всех освободительных армий Адольфу Гитлеру.
They were turned against their own people. Those who refused were ruthlessly dealt with by the Nazi collaborators.
А если среди нас найдутся шкурники или провокаторы, то мы сами беспощадно расправимся с ними.
The Great Patriotic War was drawing to the close. Stalin was at the height of his glory. He knew quite well that nobody would ever judge the vanquisher of Hitler. So, at the end of the war, he carried out some of his most horrible crimes.
Stalin exiled about a dozen of nations completely, part and parcel, young and old, women and men, even members of the Communist Party among them. They were all exiled to Central Asia, to Kazakhstan, Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, Karachaevs, Crimean Tatars, a dozen of nations completely wiped out.
The Soviet deportations, although on a much bigger scale, were similar to deportations by the SS. The descriptions are just horrific. 60, 70 people in a closed cattle truck with no sanitary provisions, just a hole in the floor, packed so tightly that they had to stand up, they couldn't sit down. And when the train stopped, they would unload hundreds of corpses of people who died on the way.
Un tā vilkām vēl divas krievietes ar ragutiem vilkām skapiem. Šausmīgs sniegs bija par upi vilkām. Bet tad tiešām, ka mandēliņu vilka, tad tos sargi bija noņemti. Tā jau viss, kas mira, bērns glabāja pie privātajiem. Tos neskaitīja, ka tie ir apcietinātie, tos pie privāti. Mums jau raka purvā. Un tad viens atkal bērnīši nomira. Tad es neatceros, cik vai bija pusgads vai gads bija. Tad es atkal vilku to, un tad es tikai aizgājis pie savu dēlu. Un tā bija pēdīga reize. Vienreiz es apcietu.
In May 1945, the Allies defeated Hitler. This horrible film footage was shown in the West, a Nazi concentration camp after liberation. But only a few understood what they were actually seeing. The site was being cleared for new inmates. The Soviets did not destroy the Nazi camps. They continued to use them after the war.
The agreement which Stalin made with the West affected the whole of Europe for the next 50 years. So although you can say the crimes